The question of the day is from Jeff and also from Saeed. What is the AEL/AFL button on my camera? Some cameras have an AEL/AFL button, some have an AEL button, some have a separate AF on button, some don't have any. They are all related, and depending upon your camera, your button may act differently than mine. And you can often change the function of the button. So I can tell you the basics of the button, but keep in mind that you should check your camera's manual and corresponding menu item to determine exactly what your button or buttons do. Now that's out of the way, what does AEL/AFL even stand for? It is Auto Exposure Lock, Autofocus Lock. AF on is autofocus on. The default on my Nikon D800 here is for the AEL/AFL button to lock both exposure and focus. So I half press my shutter release button to find focus and exposure. Then, while pressed, I press the AEL/AFL button. Keeping that pressed, I can release my shutter release button and recompose my image, but the focus and exposure will remain the same so long as I have the AEL/AFL button pressed. I also have the AF on button on this camera, which focuses the camera, just like when I half press the shutter release button. If your camera doesn't have an AEL/AFL button, it doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't have the functionality. Take, for example, my Canon T4i here. If you want to lock exposure, you half press the shutter release button to lock focus, then press this button that has a little star over it to lock exposure. That way you can lock exposure in a different place than you have focused. Or some cameras simply have the shutter release button set to behave as an AEL/AFL button, where it locks both focus and exposure while half pressed. Assuming you have one of these special buttons or the ability to configure a button on your camera to behave like one, why would you use it? Well, some people disable focusing on the half press of the shutter release button and just use their AEL/AFL or AF on button. That's just a matter of preference. If you configure the button to lock exposure only and your shutter release button focuses on the half press, you have the ability to lock focus and exposure on two different parts of the image, which may come in handy. The autofocus lock function is useful when you're using continuous servo autofocus because you can effectively switch to single servo autofocus for one shot without having to actually change the focus settings. There are a couple things to remember. If you lock focus, make sure neither you nor your subject moves forward or back. If the distance between you and your subject changes, they may not end up being in focus when you take the photo. If you are using the super smart metering or autofocus modes of the camera, like matrix or evaluative metering or auto area autofocus, you may not get the results that you're looking for with the AEL/AFL button. Like I said in the beginning, whatever button or buttons you have, AEL/AFL, AEL, AF on, check your camera's manual to see exactly how they behave. Check your camera's menus as well because the buttons are often configurable. Thanks for the question, guys.